One of the main themes of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 4 Diamond Does Not Crash is the idea that anyone in your neighborhood could be dangerous, given that Keicho was going around giving stands to people of different walks of life. But not everyone was dangerous in the same way, and among the serial killers and violent thugs were the less life-threatening dangers, such as stalkers or conmen. And one of the best examples of this is Tamamine Kobayashi in his stand, The Lock. Tamamine Kobayashi is a resident of Morioka who acted in the story of Part 4 as a minor antagonist turned minor ally for the main cast. He originally worked as just a regular conman, but after he was struck with the stand arrow, he slowly evolved his cons to work with his ability. Though before we get too into that, we should understand the meaning behind his name. Tamamine Kobayashi is an interesting name due to the fact that it's actually not that interesting at all. It's a very boring common Japanese name, because even when you break down the Japanese that comprises it, you get Tamamine, which means beautiful gem, which I guess you could argue plays into his conman job, seeing as he would end up selling a lot of stolen or acquired gemstones to pawn shops. And along with this, Tamamine himself says that the Tama and Tamamine can also mean balls, as in big balls like he's a big tough guy. But then you have Kobayashi, which when broken down just means small forest. Maybe it just means he's a small time criminal, but the only real notable thing about Kobayashi is that it's one of the 10 most common family names in all of Japan. Though I would argue a lot of this normalness in Tamamine's name is in reference to the protagonist of the Who album that he gets his stand's name from, that being Jimmy, the working class delinquent, from the album Quadrophenia. And Tamamine seems to reference this character in more than just his name. As you see, they're both part of a subculture of delinquents, with Jimmy being part of the British mod, and Tamamine being part of the more wannabe Yakuza. Tamamine also wears a shirt with a big Union Jack on the front, which is in reference to both The Who being an English band and Jimmy being an English mod, though the outfit does have other flags on it. The Union Jack is the most prominent one, and it appears in most of his art. And of course, their most defining moments come when they reach the rock in their life, or in Tamamine's case, the lock. The lock is Tamamine's automatic stand, and it takes the form of a giant U-shaped lock with the Japanese character for money on the side of it. The lock itself seems to have a physical form that Tamamine can call upon whenever he wants, but he normally waits for its ability to activate to have it appear. And that ability is Heavy Conscience. And how it works is Tamamine first needs to get his target to feel guilty for something. This can be related to him or not, it doesn't really matter as long as the target feels guilty. But after they show their guilt, a lock will generate from their bodies, appearing to have bursted from their chest. The lock has no operational range, so it will stay attached to the person until Tamamine either manually removes it, or the person absolves themselves of guilt in some way.
You can knock me out or run 1,000 miles away, but you're never getting rid of that thing.
Usually by paying Tamamine for his quote-unquote damages, or realizing that there was nothing to feel guilty for in the first place. But until they free themselves of their guilt, the lock will begin to get heavier and heavier, giving the target's own guilt physical weight. And the heavier it becomes, the more it begins to affect its host, causing them to feel more and more extreme emotions, until eventually they feel like the only way that they can absolve themselves of guilt is to take their own lives. Along with this, Tamamine says that anyone under the effect of the lock tried to attack Tamamine, the damage will be reflected back at them. Though it is never shown to be true, and given the fact that Tamamine is a natural liar, it's hard to determine if he was just making that up on the spot to save his ass. And speaking of lying, the lock also has the keen ability of uncovering when someone is lying, likely based on the moment of guilt they feel when they do lie, so it's possible that this lie detecting nature doesn't actually work on those who don't have a conscience. Which leads me to the one main weakness of the lock, and that's that the stand relies solely on the target's own ability to feel guilt. If a person is attacking Tamamine and doesn't feel guilty for it, then they can just continue beating the shit out of him and the lock will be basically useless. And even if they are afflicted with the lock, if they get a sudden surge of determination or are shown something that alleviates their guilt, the lock will dispel itself and Tamamine will be defenseless. Though it is undetermined because Tamamine never does it in the story, but since Tamamine can spawn the lock whenever he needs it, if he could possibly use it as a defense mechanism, maybe swing it around like a blackjack or something. But besides that, he's basically defenseless. Now, the lock gets its name from the Who song, The Rock, which is one of the final songs on the album Quadrophenia, which is an album that details the story of a British mod named Jimmy, who is a big The Who fan, and he throws his normal 9-to-5 life away for something more fun and exciting on the road. Though this destructive nature leads to him distancing himself from his old family and friends, and he's overwhelmed with the guilt that he feels from doing this, so much so that he steals a boat and heads to a rocky pier he calls The Rock. Here he overthinks his life, and the end of the album is left ambiguous for the listener, so that they can make the decision on whether Jimmy reformed himself that night on The Rock, or if he took his own life. And this story of Jimmy fits quite well with Tamamine as a character, as Tamamine himself has said before that he doesn't want to work a day in his life, much like how Jimmy wanted to abandon his 9-to-5 for a more exciting one. Also, the song The Rock is heavily connected to the feeling of guilt, as it is the guilty part of the story, since it's the first time in the album where Jimmy starts to actually reflect on his actions, which is closely related to the lock's own ability. Now, the reason that Araki introduced Tamamine to the story is because he wanted to experiment more with more psychological fights in JoJo. He said he wanted a stand that wasn't a direct threat to a target, but was more of a mental one. Also, he wanted a threat that you couldn't defeat with brute force, which is basically the same logic he used for Steely Dan actually, but he wanted it to be a more suburban threat than a hired assassin. Thus, he came up with an extortionist who has the ability to put a lock on your heart. He also had Tamamine appear much taller than Koichi in his introduction because he wanted to give off the idea that Tamamine was a big and scary threat, even though in reality he was actually 2 inches shorter than Koichi. Because, from Koichi's perspective, Tamamine was this big scary man. He was intimidating with his stand and dwarfed him in his control over people. Not to mention he was an adult. And since Koichi is the story's narrator, that means us, the viewers, are perceiving the world from however Koichi perceives it, which is also the reason why, after Koichi defeats Tamamine, he shrinks significantly in size, since Koichi no longer perceives him as a big and scary threat. And from this point on, Tamamine would become more of a fun cameo character, appearing only a few more times throughout Part 4, mainly to aid the main cast when he does appear, sometimes at the cost of his own health, along with appearing once in a Thus Spoke Rohan Kishibe episode. He adds a sort of spice to Moriocho's culture, as someone who's part of the underworld of the town, but isn't unredeemably evil for doing so. In fact, Tamamine almost embraces his skills and scumminess, as he picks up a job with the actual Yakuza in casinos to go after people who need to pay their debts, using his interrogation tactics to get them to pay up rather quickly. He's actually rather harmless for the most part. He doesn't even really want to fight with people, even saying himself that he hates violence. He's just someone who wants to make a little bit of cash and not have to work a day in his life. All in all, Tamamine is no more dangerous than your average street rat. Well, except for the actual street rat in Morio that is incredibly dangerous. But that's a video for another day. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more videos like it in the future, I have a Patreon at patreon.com/MinnieNotTheBadGuy. And if you want to unlock that guilt in your heart, well, you can do so by buying a copy of Shimonetta, A Boring World Where the Concept of Dirty Jokes Doesn't Exist, at buyshimonetta.com. It'll absolve you of all of your guilt.